A big part of the American national consciousness revolves around its political tradition. A republic built on an idealistic foundation of democracy and individual liberty is something to be cherished and never to be taken for granted. After all, it is no big secret that the absolute majority of republics throughout history have failed, either conquered by outside forces or degenerating into some sort of one-person rule. The parallels between the Roman Republic and the United States of America are usually presented as a cautionary tale of what might happen if we do not learn from history and end up making the same mistakes as the Romans. After all, the history of the United States mirrors that of ancient Rome in a remarkable number of ways. When the states of ancient Greece and the states of medieval Europe entered an era of exploration, they began settling the known world. Greek colonists carried Hellenic civilization across the seas, with some of them settling in Italy. It is here where the descendants of those first colonists would found Rome. Looking over to the 17th century, we see English colonists carrying European civilization in its most strict, puritanical form over to the New World. After the tax burden laid on them by an overseas king becomes intolerable, they win their liberty and establish a republic. Rome, too, is at first ruled by a foreign Etruscan king. In 509 BC, this king was overthrown and the republic was established instead. The founding documents of the United States and their early amendments recognize a set of God-given rights and freedoms. Meanwhile, the worship of liberty in the Roman Republic reaches such a level that Libertas is enshrined as a goddess, with her own temple on the Aventine Hill. These freedoms were not universal. At first, only the Roman patricians enjoyed the full spectrum of Roman liberty, and in the United States, the franchise was severely restricted as well, not to mention the existence of slavery in both nations. Through a prolonged struggle, including political unrest and civil wars in both the Roman and the American republics, those rights and liberties became universal, giving a say to those who had previously been excluded from the political process. Looking at the external situation, we see both Rome and the United States expand in territory and influence until both assume a hegemonic position in the known world. Both meet an equal along the way, different in constitution and history, and yet similar in character and ambition. With this equal, they proceed to engage in a prolonged struggle of titanic proportions. The Cold War between America and Russia, akin to the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, produced a world where one power, at least for a moment, reigned supreme and unchallenged. Now the ancestral homeland of the original colonists, the Old World suddenly finds itself in an inferior position compared to their erstwhile colony. It attempts to gain more clout on the world stage by resorting to federalism. In this parallel-seeking narrative, the Achaean League and the European Union serve the same function. The nations of the Old World can no longer afford to squabble among themselves. Too much blood was shed already in the mutually ruinous Peloponnesian Wars or in World War I and II. If we manage to unite, all of us together may have just enough to stand up to the all-conquering Romans, to the globally dominant Americans. Here the parallel becomes as sinister as the narrator wants it to be. Behold the growing income inequality, the failed reforms of the Gracchi brothers and of Senator Bernie Sanders, the outsourcing of American jobs to cheap foreign labor, mirroring the outsourcing of Roman jobs to imported slave labor. If the parallel is presented from a right-wing perspective, it may include an anti-immigrant sentiment, telling us of barbaric tribes which move inside the Roman borders without integrating into Roman society and maintaining their tribal allegiances instead. If presented from a more left-wing point of view, the narrative may mention the two-party system, Republicans and Democrats following in the footsteps of the Roman optimates and populares. The optimates, meaning the best ones, stood for conservative values and strove to uphold the existing oligarchy by leveraging their power in the existing institutions. The populares, meaning the demagogues, claimed to stand for the interest of the common man and often resorted to street activism, protests, and direct action in their methods. In the Roman example, neither party was able to fully deal with the problems plaguing the late Republic. At the end of most comparisons, there is a new civil war, at the end of which the enfeebled and corrupt democracy is replaced by a strong and stable dictatorship. The Republic is abolished in favor of an empire. Welcome to the stage for your second civil war, America. I wonder who your Marius and Sulla will be. There are parts that fit less well, of course. America does not conquer land, or at least not in the manner of the Romans. Any colonies it made during the 19th century, with the exception of a few minor islands, have long been given independence. Unlike Rome, America is more a naval power than it is a land power. It has no reason to be. There is no dangerous land border which needs to constantly be guarded against a potential invasion. And no, the Mexican cartels smuggling drugs through the Chihuahuan Desert are not comparable to the invading hordes of the Cimbri or the Teutones in the 2nd century BC. These differences would not seem large enough to undo the whole parallel, if not for the fact that there is another country existing in the same time period which fits it much better. Consider the Punic Wars, where there are two superpowers struggling for world domination. On one side is Carthage, a capitalist sea power with an economy that largely relies on commerce, and a society where status depends primarily on one's wealth. Its generals embrace military innovation and win through brilliant and often unexpected stratagems. On the other side, we have Rome, an agrarian land power where social status is derived in large part from one's lineage and military exploits. Its generals, at this point at least, often rely on a brute force approach in battle, trusting in Roman valor and Roman virtue to carry them to victory. Unable to design a proper warship of their own, they resort to reverse engineering a Carthaginian one. For this power, massive losses in manpower and resources are no reason to sue for peace. Now, which of the two sounds more like the United States of America? And if we draw a parallel to the Cold War, which of the two sounds like Russia? Ancient Carthage too was founded by immigrants, colonists from Phoenicia, and aside from having a thriving market economy, its system was more of a democracy than Rome was, which is also the view held by ancient historians such as Livy and Polybius. Carthage had a powerful constitutional court and an early variant of a system of checks and balances designed to prevent an aspiring dictator from usurping power. To that end, political office and military command were strictly separated, for example. Polybius even goes so far as to condemn the Carthaginian system as too democratic, saying that while the Roman system allowed its rulers to make executive decisions quickly, the Carthaginians spent precious hours debating and voting and squabbling about parliamentary procedure. To any American, this, no doubt, sounds like a familiar complaint made about their system. Any Carthaginian, meanwhile, would nod with approval when learning that the Americans acquired most of their territory through purchase, paying with dollars instead of lives. Rome, on the other hand, shares many similarities with Russia, and the words Third Rome are not just a meme. Caesar's conquest of Gaul entailed a genocide of 2/3 of the native Gallic population, and such severity was not unusual. These are the famous words from Calgacus, leader of the Caledonian Confederacy, spoken when Rome came to conquer northern Britain. Neither east nor west can say their appetite. They are the only people on earth to covet wealth and poverty with equal craving. They plunder, they butcher, they ravish, and they call it by the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace. On newly conquered territories, the Romans settled their own people. This was the land promised to veterans for their service. It does not need to be said that when America conquered West Germany or Japan or took over the Philippines, they did so in a manner that is in no way comparable to a Roman conquest. Those familiar with Russian history, however, will recognize the aforementioned practice immediately. They will recognize it from Ivan the Terrible, who after defeating Novgorod and wiping out Russian democracy unto this day, dispossessed Novgorodian landowners in favor of his loyal cavalrymen. But there is no need to go that far back in history to see a Russian example of Roman conquest. In 1945, the Russians captured Königsberg, the old Prussian capital. Whether the mid-century Germans deserved it, they probably did, is an unrelated topic. Fact is that today only 0.4% of the city is of German extraction. The Russians expelled, starved or outright killed the native population and brought in ethnic Russian settlers instead. For those settlers, the state erected barrack-like apartment blocks to replace traditional German architecture, and with the exception of a few decorative relics, Kaliningrad now looks unmistakably Russian. The Russian character of the Romans, on the other hand, is on full display in the Second Punic War. After Hannibal crosses the Alps, he defeats the Romans at Trebia, then at Lake Thrasymene, and then at Cannae, dealing the Romans some of the most crushing defeats they would ever have to suffer. Rome had lost over a fifth of its male population, and parts of Roman Italy switched sides and declared their allegiance to Carthage. Hannibal hoped that after being so thoroughly destroyed, the Romans would sue for peace, that they would reach out to him for a settlement. Yet nothing of the sort happened. When Hannibal reached out to the Roman Senate, they refused to engage in any negotiations. Instead, the Romans prohibited, under threat of death, any mention of the word peace, banned the display of tears in public, and mobilized the totality of the men and resources remaining to them. Instead of surrendering, the Romans went into a total war, a war of extermination, a people's war. Roman civilization would come out victorious from this, or not at all. When Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, the Red Army suffered a number of defeats and a mind-boggling number of casualties. In a way, even the tactics used by the Wehrmacht were not too different from Hannibal's. Mobile spearheads break through on the flanks and then turn to create a pocket. An encirclement differing only in scale from the one the Romans found themselves in at Cannae. After losing their own Battle of Cannae several times over at the battles of Minsk, Smolensk and Kiev, the Russians found themselves in a similar situation as the Romans 2,000 years ago. Like Hannibal, Hitler expected the Russians to surrender. "We have to only kick in the door," he famously said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Hitler did not understand, perhaps, how similar in origin the Russian national character was to the Roman one. In 289 BC, when Rome was not much more than a city-state, it suffered a traumatic experience. The Celtic warlord Brennus descended upon Rome, defeated the Roman armies at the Battle of Allia, and sacked the city itself for 8 months. The Romans, holed up on the Capitoline Hill, tried to negotiate a ransom in gold that it would take for the Celts to depart. When measuring out the agreed-upon amount, and when the inevitable haggling about the proper weights and measures began, Brennus threw his own sword onto the scales as an additional weight, thus ending the dispute by demonstrating raw power. "I have altered the deal. Pray that I do not alter it further," he said, channeling his inner Darth Vader. His actual quote is "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. It is easy to see how Romans ever since had it ingrained in them to avoid being the conquered ones ever again. Russia, of course, has a similar story. When the Mongol invaders burned Russian cities in the 13th century, Russian civilization was under threat of extinction. From proud Scandinavian princedoms, the Russians were reduced to lowly vassals, forced to swear fealty to the Khan in the most submissive Eastern fashion. It was over a century later when they could finally throw off the accursed Tatar yoke. Having experienced subjugation and defeat at an early stage in their history, the Russians, just like the Romans, were and are determined to do whatever it takes to prevent it from happening again. It is also easy to see how a country with a foundational story like that would feel unjustifiably threatened when some of their democratic neighbors voluntarily join a defensive alliance. Hitler underestimated the staying power of the Russians and their willingness to suffer as many casualties as necessary and then some. When Stalin issued orders to shoot officers who retreated, he was acting in the spirit of the Romans when they had banned the word peace from being spoken out aloud. When all Russia mobilized for a total people's war instead of negotiating, they followed in the footsteps of the Romans. Never again would Russia have to beg a foreigner for mercy. Later, when the Soviets used communist spies to steal the plans and reverse engineer the nuclear bomb in 1949, they were emulating those Romans who, after obtaining a Carthaginian warship, reverse engineered it to make one of their own. So what does it mean that Russia is Rome's descendant and that Carthage is an form of the United States? In part, this video is a response to those who foretell America's doom by comparing it to Rome. They say that history repeats itself, but does America's history have to repeat that of Rome? One may instead view the Cold War as Carthage coming back for a rematch, 2,000 years after the conclusion of the Punic Wars. This new Carthage has made improvements. It may even have taken on board a number of elements of the Roman Republican system. After all, it seems that you can't build a resilient nation on mercantile pursuit alone. We know today that the Roman victory against Carthage handed them the keys to world domination, or that of the known world at least. But what did they do with that power? We saw centuries of imperial stagnation with little technological progress to speak of, culminating in a 500-year-long dark age. Perhaps now that Carthage 2.0 has emerged victorious instead, a new dark age can be entirely avoided. And that is a message of hope.